You really got to have a solid compliance program in place to make sure that you're understanding your potential exposure. The last thing that you would want is to be associated with someone that runs afoul of sanctions, which are tied into our national security. That would be a reputational risk nightmare for anyone.
Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast. This is a 5-part series on geopolitical risk intelligence, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with part 4 of our 5-part series on geopolitical risk intelligence, the 2023 Outlook, sponsored by Infortal Worldwide. I'm thrilled to have back with me Chris Mason. First of all, Chris, welcome back.
Yeah, great to be here, Tom. Really looking forward to the conversation today.
Chris, one of the biggest or most important things that has come about in the business intelligence world since the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been sanctions intelligence. But I don't want to limit it to the Russian invasion because it started long before under the Obama administration. It ramped up during the Trump administration, and of course under the Biden administration after the Russian invasion. But sanctions, trade sanctions, economic sanctions is one of the most dynamic and changing tools our U.S. government has put in place in many years. So I wanted to maybe start off by asking you to tell us about any recent regulations or changes you've seen and the impact for the business community.
It's definitely a fascinating space. I mean, a lot of these sanctions that are being issued and the subsequent enforcement actions that we're seeing hit the headlines through the federal government press releases, they honestly read like Ian Fleming novels. It's really wild stuff. You know, you've got the oligarchs that obviously everyone is pretty familiar with, but now it's getting more and more complex. The level of detail that is now featured in the sanctions that are being issued is pretty amazing. Just last week, there was a set of sanctions issued against a certain set of individuals in the weapons trade. And for one of the individuals, they actually listed their Bitcoin and Ethereum coin address. And so the level of detail is staggering. You know, if you're accepting payments through Bitcoin, you now need to be checking to make sure that that address is not sanctioned. It's a really wide and complex web that's being weaved through the sanctions issuing process. For businesses at all levels, and this goes back to how we work with our clients, it's really important to assess your exposure, to really take a holistic view of your business and understand where your sanctions exposure may be. The critical areas to look at are, one, who are you doing business with? Who are your partners? Make sure you have a pretty good understanding of that. What does your client base or your customer base look like? And do you have a program for vetting your customers? That's extremely important. And then make sure that you have a set of compliance documents that really maps out what your program looks like. That's going to be more important as these sanctions regimes get more complex.
You really hit on something there, or actually, before we get to that question, I wanted to change the focus a little bit to ask, how do you help a company think through the, I don't want to say daily changing, because that was really during the Trump administration, but almost the ever-changing sanctions. And the last time I looked, I think we're on the 9th or 10th round of sanctions against Russia. But as new rounds of sanctions go into place, new sanction evasion strategies are used by Russia and Russian oligarchs and friends of Russia. And so we have another round to respond to that. How do you help a company think through responding to the ever-changing amount and nature of sanctions? Or is that encompassed in having a holistic plan in place?
It really does start with setting a plan. You've got to make an assessment and understand what your current sanctions exposure looks like. And then once you understand that, you can build out a plan going forward, which, because the sanctions regimes are constantly changing, you will have to adapt the plan, but really setting up a plan that you have documented, that your team can follow, that really allows you to mitigate your potential exposure. And it's going to look a lot of different ways depending on the makeup of your business and the industries that you're in. But one of the things that I think is important to point out in the sanctions space is I think in 2023, it's really going to be the year of the evaders and those that are helping individuals avoid sanctions. And so you really need to be careful in terms of looking at who you're doing business with and making sure that there's no exposure to sanctions evasion.
Chris, I want to maybe call upon your background in the U.S. government, because one of the things the Department of Treasury, Vincent, and others have made clear is they view these sanctions as a national security issue to the United States. And to the Trump administration's credit, I think that they made the same announcement. So this is really administration agnostic. What I wanted to ask you is, as a regulator, when something is elevated to a true national security issue, and we saw the Biden administration raise anti-corruption to that, what does that really mean from the regulatory perspective in terms of seriousness of how a regulator would look at a company if it truly is a national security issue?
It absolutely raises the stakes, Tom. From a regulatory standpoint, what it means is once you're in the national security territory and once the stakes are that high, you're really going to have the best and brightest in terms of those within the federal government working to push those programs forward. From a law enforcement perspective, that means you're also going to have task force. You're going to have sort of the elite groups within the law enforcement agencies really focused on these issues. And so you really can't get these types of issues wrong. You really got to have a solid compliance program in place to make sure that you're understanding your potential exposure. The last thing that you would want is to be associated with someone that runs afoul of sanctions, which are tied into our national security. That would be a reputational risk nightmare for anyone.
And now let me pick up on reputational risk, because you've added a factor we haven't really touched on this podcast series. We've really focused on regulatory enforcement, governmental enforcement, those types of issues. But you've raised now reputational issues. And frankly, I think that is as big or bigger, at least to market share or overall cap of a company. And I would point to companies that dilly-dallied around about exiting Russia. I think that they were punished in the marketplace, and they were punished by consumers. They were punished by the financial considerations. They were punished in the stock market in many ways. So could maybe end by talking about just that, how significant reputational damage is to a company.
Reputation is so closely tied to company value these days. Information travels so quickly that if you get associated with a violation that hits any of these areas that we've discussed through this series, it's going to be immediately apparent to everyone that that was the case, that the information is going to be out there, and the potential costs for that, especially once you start looking at middle market businesses, I mean, that can be a game changer. That can really completely destroy your business. So circling back to what we've been discussing, taking the steps to really understand your risk exposure, setting up a plan that you can put in place that's easy for your team to follow can definitely help you avoid these types of reputational risks and regulatory problems.
Chris, I think that's a great way for us to end this podcast. I hope our listeners will join us next time for our fifth and final podcast, where we look at supply chain intelligence. And before we leave, I wanted to ask our listeners who wanted any more information on any of the topics we touched on, what would be the best place for them to go?
Best place to go is to hit our website, and that's infortal.com. Thanks, Tom.
Chris, thanks so much. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you.